I know I'm supposed to talk about China, and I promise I will get to China, but I thought, there's an issue out there that I think I need to take head on because it's been really ugly in the United States these past several years. And, the prospect, and everyone obviously has been watching what's been going on in recent months, and the prospect of seeing a repeat of it this fall of what we saw a few years ago, I think has been really weighing on all of us. And I think everyone, here today joins me in just sort of breathing a sigh of relief that the Houston Astros are not in the World Series this year. And I know that this is your warm up for the World Series, so I will try to be as lively as possible. I said I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I should reveal that even though I'm a South Sider, I'm a Cubs fan. And if you know Chicago, that is it's a terrible thing to admit, to be a South Side Cubs fan. I come by it genetically. My dad grew up a lifetime Cubs fan. And so, although I'm a South Sider, I love the Chicago Cubs. And I will say there is a real psychic cost to being a Cubs fan. But I tell people that one of the really good things about liking the Chicago Cubs is it really prepares you for work in US-China diplomacy. It teaches you to suffer. It teaches you to take a long-term perspective. And ultimately, it teaches you to be optimistic in the face of evidence, all the evidence to the contrary. So let me talk about China. As Stan said, I graduated from university, kind of stumbled into a scholarship to go to Taiwan, and ended up in Shanghai in early 1990s, right after the Tiananmen massacre. And I got into the China business essentially because I was a little late to the game for Japan. You all remember the 1980s, and Japan is #1, and they were the next big thing. And by the time I got to the game, it was too late to learn the language. I wasn't much of a business person, and then I didn't have much of a shot. On the political side, everything was the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the US-Soviet rivalry. And I guess I just wasn't, my head wasn't round enough, and I wasn't wise enough to involve myself in that. And so I looked around, I said, well, there are a billion Chinese. Not many people are interested in that. And so that's where I sort of, by mercenary motives more than anything else, ended up with a career working on China. And I will say that and Stan, you talked about the course of my career, going back and forth 6 times ultimately in Greater China, until I finally left government in 2017 as you said, the Chargé d'Affaires, the acting ambassador in China. And boy, that country changed an awful lot in the space of those 3 decades. And I think back to when I started going to China in 1990, how all of this transformational economic growth was all in the future at that point. Most of it was, and Stan, you'll remember this from our time in the 90s in China, lots of grandiose plans, but still a fairly poor country, a country that you didn't have to scratch very deep at all and to see the scars of the Cultural Revolution, to see really developing world economic status. But even then, as China was emerging from the Cultural Revolution and emerging from the chaos of Mao, Deng Xiaoping had a vision of China as a rich and a powerful country. And like me, I guess you'd say that Deng Xiaoping looked around and looked at Japan and said, that's the economic model we want to follow. A disciplined workforce and a government that's highly involved in the business of business. So close connections between government and the private sector, or and the economy. And he looked at the Soviet Union, just as I had when I was coming out of university, and took a very opposite conclusion. Took a conclusion that that's not the direction we want to go. That the problem the Soviet Union, the mistake they made was trying to do both economic and political reform. And the lesson was you can do economic reform, you can act like the Japanese economically, but acting like the Soviets politically is a recipe for disaster. And so, Deng, that was, even as he experimented with economic reform, the party and the state maintained a dominant position politically. That's been, a lot has changed in the last 30 years, but that has been a consistent feature of the Chinese political system since then. So I, came and went to China a couple of more times before ending up, I guess it would have been in the mid-2000s, and I kind of marked Deng was dead by then, but I marked the end of the Deng era really, and you all remember this as well as I do, probably better because I was carrying bags at the time for high-level visitors, but the Beijing Olympics, the 2008, you remember an hour after hour of this really spectacular opening ceremony, highlighting the glories of Chinese civilization and history and the accomplishments over the last 30 years. And for a lot of Chinese, that they saw this as they had arrived, they're coming of age on the world stage. So that was August of 2008. You all probably remember the next event that I'm going to talk about, and you have probably not connected it in your minds with China's development the way most Chinese have. But 3 weeks later, 3 weeks after the opening ceremony, the Lehman Brothers collapsed and triggered the global financial crisis that's now called the Great Recession. A huge, traumatic impact on the American economy. And a lot of Chinese looked at that as kind of the other shoe for a lot of Chinese. They saw what had happened, and for about 3 decades, Chinese economists and planners and business people had looked to the United States as a model, had looked to the West and Western management as an example to follow. And you can really, I mark the end of the Deng era of economic reform to the summer of 2008, as a lot of Chinese said, you know what, we got this. The American model worked so well, but our model's working pretty well for us, and we'll take it from here. And so even though Xi Jinping was not in power yet at 2008, I mark that as this kind of the end of the era of reform and the beginning of the era we're now in, which I call the era of Xi Jinping, or the era of rejuvenation, his term for the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. That's his quote. So, and there's a lot of changes in Xi's China from Deng Xiaoping or Mao before him. But what hasn't changed is the overarching goal of a China that is rich and powerful, a China that can't be pushed around anymore, and has the role in the world, in the region, and in global society that the Chinese believe they deserve. So, who is Xi Jinping? I think that's probably, we'll be seeing a lot of Xi Jinping in the coming decades, so it's probably a good question to ask. I kind of see him, my shorthand is, he is a nationalist, he is a party animal, and he is a control freak. So, a nationalist that he is motivated by the interests of China, this, again, sort of make China great again approach to the world. He's a party animal, not in the sense of staying out late at night, but being a creature of the Communist Party. His father was a leader of the party in Mao's era, and she was brought up as sort of a princeling in that great, the next generation of leaders. And finally, he's a control freak, that she sees himself as the center, and he sees what is good for him as being good for the party, and what's good for the party is good for China. So a set of mutually reinforcing relationships with Xi Jinping at the center. And I would say you saw that most clearly. I'm sure some of you noticed, and everyone's heard the news, that it was about 1.5 years ago now, in March of 2019, when, to the surprise of a lot of people, surprised me, surprised a lot of Chinese, they have this annual event, the National People's Congress, the sort of rubber stamp legislative body gets together once a year in March. And in March, about a year and a half ago, very quickly surprised the delegates by pushing through a change to the Constitution that allowed Xi Jinping to remain in power essentially indefinitely. And that's a lot of people looked at that, and one of the crowning achievements of Deng Xiaoping was to get rid of the trappings of the Mao era of concentration of power, and Deng put in place these structures that prevented the kind of power struggle and the kind of cult of personality that Mao had put in place. Xi pushes that aside, has now enabled himself to be leader of China for life. And in fact, in some ways has made it really difficult for him not to be leader for life, because once you don't have a set process for replacing, for coming up with a new leader, you don't have the mechanisms for picking and grooming and bringing up promising young people. And so we're now in a situation in China where, well, whether we like it or not, whether the Chinese people like it or not, whether Xi Jinping likes it or not, I think he's likely to remain at the head of the party for quite a long time. So, Xi Jinping is in charge for as long as he wants, or probably as long, even if he doesn't want. There is no apparent threat to him within China. One of the basic questions here in the United States of whether a president will be reelected is, they call it right direction, right track, wrong track. Is the country going the right direction, wrong direction? In the US, if you're not above 50%, you're going to have a tough time being reelected. Xi Jinping is way above re-election status in the US. He's probably 70, 80, 90%. China is going in the right direction. So there's no real sort of systemic opposition to him, nor is there any popular or significant popular opposition to him. People aren't happy with a lot of the way things run, but overall they're satisfied with the direction the country is headed. Part of that is because the economy continues to do really well. The economy has been growing at a remarkable pace for decades, and with a little downtick for the coronavirus, which I'll talk about in a minute, it's probably doing better than any other major economy in the world. At the same time, China's global role is expanding. China's got more leverage in international organizations, is doing more globally than any time in recent history. So it would seem like everything is going pretty well for Xi Jinping. But from my time in China, not just when I left in 2017, but over 20 or 30 years, you don't get the sense from the Communist Party, you don't get the sense that they're resting comfortably, that they're relaxed about the situation and the durability of Communist Party control. Lots of signs of that. Over the last 5 years, about 1 million members of the Communist Party have been disciplined. There have been some high-level prosecutions, but lots and lots of lower-level discipline, from people being thrown out of the party to being fined to being arrested. 1 million party members. Internet censorship was bad, Stan, when you and I were there 20 years ago. It is much more comprehensive now, and it is the government devotes far more resources to monitoring, tracking, and censoring what's going on in cyberspace. Likewise, getting access to outside websites much harder than it used to be. There are hundreds of millions of security cameras now around the country. Really pervasive integration of surveillance cameras and government systems for monitoring the population. Some of you may have heard about the social credit system, where everything you do from, paying your taxes to if you're caught running red lights is sort of tabulated and processed by a central system, and it decides, are you allowed to book a plane ticket? Can you get on the train? All sorts of different sort of aspects of your social and economic life are governed by this social credit system. And then, of course, everyone has seen what's been going on. More than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China's far west have been either put in or processed through what they call re-education camps, which sure look like concentration camps from all of the reporting from the outside. So why does she seem so nervous? You know, why, if the country and the party are so generally popular, the economy is doing so well, you know, why doesn't he act why isn't he easy in his shoes? I would say I attribute it to a few reasons. One, just because they can, you know, that China is the Communist Party is exerting more control simply because they can, because they have better tools for surveillance, for monitoring, for tracking of the internet. And, you know, one of the operating principles of the party is to prevent alternatives to party rule. And the way you do that is nip things in the bud. But I think also Xi is worried because governing China is getting harder, that it's harder than it used to be to govern China. Because in the past, the arrangement was in exchange for economic growth, you, the ordinary citizen, agree to sort of keep quiet politically, that, you know, limited political rights in exchange for economic growth. You know, it's harder today when per capita incomes are about 10,000 a year and people are looking for more than just a couple of bucks more in their paycheck every month. They're looking for things like good schools and clean air and clean water and clean government, things that are just harder to deliver for any government, let alone a government that doesn't have the kinds of legitimizing functions that we do, elections. And then finally, a really big challenge for Xi is that what worked to drive economic growth in the past increasingly is not working today. So even without the trade tensions that are going on now, China had reached essentially by 2013, 2014, the limits of what export-led growth could do. That essentially the world can only absorb so much that can or is willing to absorb so much that's produced in a country of 1.4 billion people. So you see that in 2008, about 10% of China's GDP came from exports. Net exports accounted for about 10% of the economy. Today, it's about 2%. So that number has dropped significantly. Now, they're still a huge exporter. What has changed is now they import almost as much as they export. But China is no longer, the economy is not driven by exports primarily. The second big change is that the demographics are really turning against China. What had been a huge demographic advantage over the last 20 or 30 years, as you had this huge baby boom coming out of the Mao era, has now turned, and at the same time, a limited number of older people, because people didn't live that long before the Deng era, and a limited number of younger people because of the one-child policy. Now you have all of these children supporting this older generation, larger older generation. You know, so the burden for every individual worker is going up because of the demographic pyramid is getting much more. It looks much more like a developed countries. And then I guess another factor I'd put out there is that you know, after the leading up to the financial crisis, but then definitely after the financial crisis, China, they stimulated their economy by investing in infrastructure. So they built highways and roads and airports and high-speed rail, and it had a remarkable stimulative effect on the Chinese economy. It kept, in 2008, it kept China from going into the Great Recession that the rest of the world felt. But you know what, in 2008, about $6, about $1 of infrastructure investment would lead to $1 in GDP growth. Today, it takes about $6. So it is 6 times less efficient in this infrastructure investment in spurring growth. It's interesting, if you look at the post-COVID response, they've gone back to that toolkit though. In trying to keep the economy growing, China has gone back to infrastructure investment. The challenge to that is now China owes about over 300% of GDP in debt. So, China just a couple of decades ago essentially had no debt at a national level, now exceeds the United States as one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world. So that avenue of growth that used to be available to Xi, to the leaders of the country, is gone. And it's not just the economics that are tougher today. It's governance in general. I talked about governance domestically. Xi has tried to turn the case around though on governance globally. And you remember at the start of the COVID crisis, started in China obviously, and there was this really heartrending story of Li Wenliang, this doctor in the city of Wuhan, who was one of the first people to raise the alert, to say, hey, the government's covering this up. People are dying in the hospitals. He went on the equivalent of Twitter in China and issued the alert to his colleagues and friends and said, there's a really dangerous disease out there. And what happened, of course, the Chinese authorities, police pulled him aside and said, you're going to go to jail if you keep passing these rumors around. They forced him to retract, to confess that he had made an error. And of course, that was I would say, a very typical Chinese response to it. But what it led to is the disease broke out of in the time before the government became aware of just how bad it was. The disease broke out not just of China, not just out of Wuhan, but out of China itself. And of course, at an individual level, Li Wenliang, the doctor, died in a hospital after trying to save his patient's life. So that was in March, April. But now if you listen to what's coming out of China, you have the opposite governance story. They're telling the story that, because of the leadership of the Communist Party, the Chinese have been able to get coronavirus under control. We are uniquely positioned to respond to this kind of crisis. And in fact, for all of the shortcomings on transparency and that sort of thing, on the front end, on the back end, they've done pretty well. China is essentially back to normal now. You can get on the train, you can hop on the plane. Over the last 30 days, I think there have been 6 cases of person-to-person transmission within China. There have been a few cases of people coming in with the disease, but only 6 cases countrywide where someone has transmitted the disease to someone else within the country. And of course, those 6 cases, what did China do? They shut down an entire province, essentially. 100 million people were told to stay at home. Tens of millions of tests, door-to-door testing. Really a comprehensive effort that the United States, I don't think, could, would, or should try to compete with. But really a remarkable effort of sort of an alternative to the American or Western style of governance. And the proof is in the pudding economically. The just released a couple of days ago, China's third quarter growth statistics, they grew about 5%, which, for a US, that would be spectacular. For China, that's pretty good. For the world coming out of COVID, that's really remarkable, right? That the rest of the world is going to be scraping for 0 growth. China's at about 5%. They're essentially back. And I know the United States is going to get through COVID. It probably won't be until we've got a vaccination and we've got a little more sort of a common view of what public health steps we should be taking. But we will get through this economic problem. And I think also China's growth will slow, is in a path of slowing over the last 20, 30 years. It started at about 10% a year, then it was trying to hit 7 or 8. This year, they were going to hope to hit 4 or 5%. and that's probably optimistic with the impact of COVID. But in any event, in the coming few years, probably accelerated by COVID, our two countries' different responses, China's economy will be larger than the U.S. economy. The total, now not the per capita because it's a much more populous country, but China will just be a larger economy than the U.S. economy, and with that economic heft will become political and military heft as well. And that's where I want to get, that's where we come in, we the United States, because concern about the direction China's heading isn't something new. It's not. It didn't arise at the start of the Trump administration. Certainly, at the end of the Obama administration, there was a lot of concern about the direction of the Chinese economy, the Chinese state, and Chinese policies. And 3 years ago or 3.5 years ago, I was telling people it really didn't matter whether Donald Trump won or Hillary Clinton won. There was going to be a real change in U.S.-China relations. And I find myself saying a very similar thing now. That it really doesn't matter if Donald Trump wins, is reelected, or Joe Biden wins. That we're going to see a continuation of friction in the U.S. Between the United States and China. So, but it is kind of a study in contrast how the last two American presidents have looked at how to deal with the challenge coming from China. The Obama administration looked at it and for the most part said, there are areas where we can cooperate with China, and in those areas we will seek to cooperate. There are areas where we've got to compete, where friction's inevitable. We will try to limit those areas and make sure that friction on the military side doesn't spill over into conflict, and that friction in pick an area, Iran, doesn't affect our dealings on, say, climate issues. And finally, the Obama administration looked to expand the role of the United States in the global systems that we had created, and to expand those systems. So, for example, I would say the centerpiece, or one of the centerpieces of the Obama administration's approach to China really had nothing to do with China directly. It was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, an agreement, a trade agreement between the United States, or among the United States, and 12 economies in the Asian basin. China wasn't expressly excluded from the TPP. No one said China absolutely couldn't join, but the provisions of the TPP were written so that it was pretty clear that China would have to dramatically change how it does business. Its support for state-owned enterprises, it's the way it handles internet freedom, environmental rules, labor rules. So it was functionally impossible for China to join unless, frankly, a very different country. And the idea being that TPP would both be a challenge to the challenges that China had made to the international structures, but would also turn what are at times liabilities for American companies, labor laws, environmental laws, into advantages, because our companies already have to meet those. And so, when we're exporting to places like Japan or Vietnam or other TPP members, it would be an advantage. Setting high standards would be an advantage for American producers. You can tell I'm a fan of TPP. I am a critic of the Obama administration's plan for passage of TPP, which, as far as I can tell, was to hope that Hillary Clinton won and pass it in the lame duck. And I thought that was a lousy plan even before Hillary Clinton lost the election. But obviously, the fact that they didn't even get the first step right, that's for something that was as critically important as TPP in my eyes. It was a real failure in vision. Sort of fast forward to the Trump administration, obviously a very, very different approach, and I would say very, very different approach, not just to TPP, not just to China, but more broadly, more generally, skepticism about the U.S. role in the world. That that as critical as the Trump administration has been of China and Chinese commercial behavior, it has been equally, or at times even more critical, of our NATO partners, allies, and partners in the European Union, Japan, and Korea. Traditional, sort of the mainstay of the post-Second World War international order that the United States created, and to a large extent led over the last 70 years. Probably the highest profile aspect of the Trump administration's China policy was trade policy. You all remember the tariffs that were put in place, hundreds of billions of dollars of products facing tariffs coming in. I have to say that the balance sheet for that aspect of the Trump administration's China policy has not been good. What was it, the Fed of, I'm reading my notes here, the Fed of New York estimates that it's about $800 to $850 a year. The average household is paying additional costs because of the cost of tariffs. Moody's estimates that about 300,000 jobs, this is before coronavirus, lost in the manufacturing sector here in the United States, knocked off about 0.3% of GDP, and that US companies lost about $1.5 trillion, a little more, from the price of their stock because of the trade war. The flip side, now obviously our trade numbers are skewed because of COVID, but it looks to be that our trade deficit, which I always thought was a terrible measure for terrible target for a lot of reasons, but it's going to be bigger than ever. Job growth in manufacturing has essentially flatlined here in the United States. And to the extent that manufacturers have moved out of China, and as Stan said at the beginning, one of the things I do is work with a consulting group helping American companies doing business in China. Very few of them are moving out of China, but to the extent some have, they're not coming back here. They're going to places like Vietnam or Mexico or elsewhere. Finally, the phase one trade deal, China committed to increase what seemed at the time to be wildly optimistic numbers in the increase in exports. And obviously it's hard to be exactly clear because of the impact of coronavirus, but it's very obvious that China is going to fall very, very short of the numbers it committed to. At the same time, essentially nothing on the core concerns about US commercial behavior, or about Chinese commercial behavior on support for state-owned enterprises, subsidies, intellectual property theft. There has been some modest incremental steps, at least on paper, on IPR protection in China. I'm not convinced it will be all that significant, and really the core issues that divide the US and China remain. And also, we're cooperating less with China. And part of that is the Trump administration has not been particularly interested in general international cooperation, and specifically the things that I think are most promising areas for cooperation with China, the Trump administration is frankly particularly hostile to. Stan, you mentioned that I left government when we pulled out of the Paris Agreement. That I think cooperating on climate, I think, is one of the essential areas where the US and China have to cooperate. The Trump administration is not interested. Similarly, the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, effort to shut down the Obama administration effort to shut down the Iranian nuclear program. One of the first things the Trump administration did was pull out of that. And at the same time, I'm not concerned, but very clear, just empirically, that those areas of cooperation and dialogue between the United States have attenuated. You see the same weakening in other international institutions, the WTO, the UN, the US pulled out of the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement on climate change is significantly weakened by the American absence. The broad multilateral effort to put controls onto the Iranian nuclear program, similarly crippled by the US departure. Now, I personally have no objection to questioning the status quo and asking whether a better approach might be in order. But I think it's important to remember as we question the status quo that even accounting for the impact of COVID, a person alive today is, statistically speaking, healthier, will live longer, eat better, be better educated, and have more disposable income than essentially any human being ever before in the history of the world. And even as we in the United States recognize that we have problems in our own society, we should also recognize that the United States remains the wealthiest large economy in the world. And so the risk I think we face today is that we're entering a world where we don't necessarily have a strong supporter for the structures and systems that have served the United States, and I would say China and the rest of the world, really, really well for the last 70 years. And we haven't figured out whether or if we're going to replace them with something else. And so I think, as we look beyond this election, look into the next decade, I see a real risk of a breakdown in international structures from which we have benefited extraordinarily without knowing what might be coming in their place. And I guess I will just maybe end where I started on an optimistic note, and that is to say that I'm a Chicago Cubs fan, right? I'm an optimist. I think ultimately I have confidence in the country that I served, and Stan, you served as well for our careers, that in the long run, we will go back to doing what it was that made us the richest, most influential, most powerful country in the world, which is we build institutions and then we lead them. We create alliances and we shape them. And we have confidence in our values and then we live them. And so maybe with that, I'll stop. I will turn it back to you, Deb and Stan, and hopefully questions.
Thank you very much. I want to invite our members, our audience, to go ahead and type questions in the chat. We do have a couple of questions there already. So we'll start with this one. You were kind of ending on that economic piece. China has made great strides within the past decade to build a green infrastructure. How much of their economic growth is because of this? And what would it take for the US to catch up? Would something like the Green New Deal help?
Well, I'll start with the end of that question first, because I don't know that much about the Green New Deal. And I know more about China and its efforts than what's been going on here. China has made remarkable investments in transitioning, or at least developing the ability to transition to a more sustainable economy, to renewable energy. They've got huge capacity in producing solar, in solar equipment and deploying it. They have done far less well in sort of figuring out how to integrate solar and other renewable energies into their power grid in a way that takes advantage of the real advantages of renewable energy. And so, there are, for all of the significant changes, and I don't want to dismiss what China has done, they have a long way to go. And one of the things that really concerned me when we pulled out of the Paris Agreement was, one, I thought it was terrible for American leadership. It is the one issue that unites every other country in the world. And if you aspire to global leadership, you have to be not just in the agreement, but leading the agreement. But as a someone who spent my career looking at China, my concern was that only the United States has both the institutional ability, the sort of political heft to hold China's feet to the fire, but also the intellectual, sort of the institutional knowledge of the questions to ask, the sort of the specific expertise make sure that China is living up to the commitments it makes. And so, for example, you saw Xi Jinping, or maybe you didn't notice that when he was at the United Nations, he rolled out a really remarkable, made a couple of commitments. He said before 2030, China would reach peak carbon emissions, that it would peak and then start trailing off, and then by 2060, it would be completely renewable energy, would sort of transition away from carbon energy production. So, that's really a significant, I don't want to diminish the importance of Xi Jinping making that kind of a commitment, but at the same time, China now has they're breaking ground on more coal plants than the entire European energy system. All energy production system, China is in the process of starting up coal plants to exceed all of the energy produced in Europe. So it's really eye-popping. You see these really good news things, they are accompanied with bad news things. And the fact that the United States isn't there to has the both interest and ability to point out those contradictions is a real problem. On the other hand, I got to say, I think it's great when individuals do things to do their part, and I think we're all going to have to do that on climate. These are really big issues, and I think it's going to require governments. It's going to require governments at the national level, and it's going to require international cooperation. So, I don't know the Green New Deal well enough to say that's exactly what needs to be done, but I do think every country is going to have really ambitious plans for, I know you're in the middle of the biggest fire in Colorado history right now. I'm in the Midwest, where we, went from record rainfalls to then a month and a half of zero rainfall at all. I mean, it's really climate change used to be something we talked about was going to happen. Now we know it is going to happen.
Great, thank you. Our audience is filling in a lot of really great questions, so we will do our best to get to all of them. This one asks, you've served under many presidents. What differences do you see between the political parties in their approach to foreign policy?
Approach to foreign policy in general, interesting. Less than you think. I mean, it's gotten a little, like every other aspect of American political life, foreign policy has become more partisan than it was when I started out. But certainly on China policy, it's been pretty consistent. The areas of disagreement were much smaller than areas of agreement. I will say one of the things that concerns me, is the devaluation, and I will say this generally has come from the Republican Party, although there has been some from the Democratic Party as well. The devaluation of the value of diplomacy, and one example of that is the JCPOA, the Iran deals one, but also the Trump administration has pulled out of a couple of treaties that the United States negotiated. And it worries me that, to pass a treaty in the Senate, you negotiate a long time with another country, and you sign an agreement, then it has to go to the Senate, you get 2/3 approval. So it's a really high barrier, really high bar to get a treaty approved, to approve a treaty and bring it into force. And the interpretation on the Trump administration has been that a president can pull out of these with essentially no recourse to the Senate, without any requirement that this extremely high bar for ratifying diplomacy. There is an extremely low bar for disrupting diplomacy. And I think that's really worrisome, because diplomacy is ultimately, I never complained about what I was paid, but we're really cheap, right? The State Department has 0 aircraft carriers. We don't, it is essentially guys like Stan and me and women out in the field, sort of working on the cheap, and it is a much much more economical way of advancing American interests than the hard power that sort of draws attention in a lot of circles in the U.S.
So another question, could you comment on China's Belt and Road Initiative? What is their motivation?
Yeah, Belt and Road Initiative, for those of you who don't know about it, it is this really, it's sort of a Marshall Plan on steroids. Depending on what you read, it's tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars of infrastructure and other investment around the world. First of all, it's probably like a lot of Chinese plans, and Stan, I'm sure you remember these, there is less there than meets the eye, that there's a lot of hype, and I've been guilty of that within the US system as well, that you know, when all is said and done, a lot more is said than is done. But even if a fraction of the Belt and Road comes to fruition, it is a really major investment in infrastructure and investment of Chinese money and influence around the world. And I think there are a number of interlocking motivations coming from China. One is they've just got a lot of money. And there are, you know, I talked about running out of good places to make investments within China in infrastructure. So you have these companies that are really good at building infrastructure, and there's really not anywhere to do it productively left in China. So they're looking for places to make those investments. So there's that. There's, you know, the overcapacity. All these Chinese factories are churning out products that they, again, you know, whether it's railroad trains or high-speed trains, you know, the huge array of things that there's no longer a market for in China. If you're building similar things in other countries, there's suddenly a market again. But there's also a geostrategic value to this, that you know, by building a port, for example, on the in Pakistan, it allows China to sort of circumvent the fact that, you know, if you look around China's east coast, it is essentially encircled by American partners and allies, from the Republic of Korea, South Korea up in the north, to Japan. You've got then Taiwan and the Philippines and Singapore's blocking off the Straits of Malacca. So you know, the east coast of China is encircled by countries that are suspicious of China and aren't necessarily friendly, and are friendly to the United States. So it's an effort to get around that geostrategic blockade. And finally, look, China's got a lot of money. You know, China has, there's a lot of energy and dynamism and money going around, and that kind of thing is, I think, perfectly natural that it's going to slosh out a little bit. So, you know, some of the aspects of the Belt and Road I worry about. I think they have implications for US interests. Some of it, though, you know, the fact is China is a much richer place, and that's the sort of thing, that's the, you know, those sorts of activities follow the fact that China is a wealthier country.
So that leads to our next question. What is the likelihood that China will surpass the United States as the #1 world power?
It kind of depends how you define it, right? It is instructive. One, I think economically, unless there's some catastrophic economic collapse in China or globally, I think it's almost inevitable that China will become the world's largest economy in the next decade or so. By some measures, it already is. By the PPP, purchasing power parity measure, China already has the world's biggest economy. Just the fact that it's 4 times the population of the United States, it's been growing at much faster rate than the US for a number of years. I think it's almost inevitable that China will have a bigger economy than ours, even though at an individual level, people aren't as wealthy. But the challenges of converting that economic power into, you know, you can convert that into military, into hard power. You can invest more and, you know, build more ships, and China's doing that, and you can you know, establish military bases, and China is doing that overseas. But what's much harder is soft power, and it has been really instructive how unsuccessful China has been at converting the economic power it has developed over the last number of decades into soft power, that there is still a ton of skepticism in the region and globally about China. If you look at the latest Pew Trust survey of global public opinions. Now, this is just global opinions in the developed world, but I think it's in the US, it's probably 75% of people have a negative or very negative view of China. That puts the US in about the middle of the pack for the developed world. That there are real skepticism about what China is doing in the world and about the prospect of China exporting its political model as it expands globally. And if you look in the region, as China has grown, people are really worried. That there is no Chinese Canada. The way the United States has a really close connection with our northern neighbor and a really close connection with our southern neighbor. If you look at China, all of the neighbors, everyone in the neighborhood has a really bad feeling about what's going on. That's the big challenge China has, and I think that is the big shortcoming to the Chinese model of development. Is just not very attractive. It's attractive to rulers in a lot of countries, but not attractive to people and populations outside of China.
So how quickly, if at all, can we get back to TPP in a leadership position when, well, that's kind of a partisan question, when the Biden administration begins? Let's just say maybe just how quickly, if at all, can we get back to TPP?
So what do I know? But it seems like Biden has been very careful to not exclude the possibility. And, he's got, I think, plenty of room to say, hey, I negotiated this when I was in government last time. You should not be surprised that I'm going back to it now. And, for all of these reasons that I talked about, it makes sense to get back into it. So, I think the challenge Joe Biden is going to have if he wins, and, that's, I think, we all have to agree is a big if. But if he wins, there are a lot of problems right now, right? I'd like to think that TPP would, getting into that would help some of the issues we have with China. It would help in a number of other areas that we've talked about. But, you got to look at democratic politics, capital D democratic politics, that TPP is not universally loved in the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden's probably going to have to, if he's president, going to have to choose his battles. Personally, I would hope that's one of the battles he would choose. I would love to see an early visit, an early visit to Japan, and an early deliverable for a Japan visit would be, where Biden says, we're interested in getting back in TPP, but by God, it's going to have to be tougher in these areas, and lay out a few things that are achievable. And the Japanese have to know this is coming, and the Kiwis know it's coming. If we get back, they're going to have to make some adjustments to what was already a hard-fought agreement to get the U.S. in, and I think they have an interest in seeing that happen.
So we've got a couple of really big questions, and I know that'd probably be a whole nother presentation. I'm going to go ahead and combine them. One is what's been happening in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and also what do you see happening with Taiwan?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, you're right. That's a big bunch of questions. My heart breaks for Hong Kong. My daughter was born there. I'm really fond of the city, and it's people who came of age in a democracy, or at least in a liberal society, and who are looking to a future when it is no longer a liberal society. I mean that 2047, when the British handed Hong Kong back to China, and essentially they had very little choice but to hand Hong Kong back. While the island itself was given in perpetuity to the United Kingdom, all of the land that allowed that island to survive had been leased for 99 years. And so when that lease expired, Hong Kong would have no longer been viable. And so the British had no choice but to negotiate the best possible deal and essentially trust for the best that China would live up to its end of the deal. Part of that deal is that Hong Kong would keep its system through 2047. As part of Xi Jinping exercising his greater control, getting back to earlier in my talk where he's a control freak, that would not tolerate the prospect of the people of Hong Kong openly rejecting the leadership of the Communist Party. Ultimately, is what it came down to, and what I think was the trigger ultimately was legislative council elections. Their congressional elections were coming up, and it looked an awful lot like the pro-democratic group, the pan-democrats, were going to win enough to sort of control the legislative process in Hong Kong, despite having the deck really being stacked against them in sort of a gerrymandering way, and that just wasn't acceptable. And China sort of changed the rules of the game. I love the city. It was a really terrific place. I am very pessimistic about the direction that it's going to go. Not immediately, but what was already an inexorable sort of degradation of what was a great place is going to accelerate. It's connected to what's going on in Xinjiang in the sense that Hong Kong was one threat to Communist Party authority. Xinjiang, the west of China, 50 years ago, it was probably 80% minority, this Uyghur minority. Now it's about 50-50, but if you get out of the big cities, it's essentially a minority province. And they don't sit easy under the yoke of the Communist Party. Most of that time it's expressed peacefully, but there has been violence. The party and the state have used a number of different approaches to try to integrate, to attract the Uyghur populations to China, to be sort of take part in the broader Chinese project. None of those worked, and I think in sort of frustration and in decision that you don't mess around with Xi Jinping, they have now said, okay, we will just crack down as hard as possible. I don't think it's going to work, and I think it's people you can't. That's one of the things that leads the Pew surveys to be so remarkably negative overseas, is that they see what's going on, and you can't hide that kind of thing, but ultimately it's a just as it is in Hong Kong, it's a question of power, and China clearly has the power to sort of maintain the security presence, to pacify, at least sort of as long as they're there, what's going on in Xinjiang.
And if we could just to circle back to Taiwan, there's a concern that China is developing amphibious assault capability. Do you see an invasion of Taiwan in the next few years?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. I worry about it, and the sort of uneasy status quo of the US informally supporting Taiwan, unofficially supporting Taiwan, Taiwan not declaring independence, not going nuclear, and China restraining, keeping itself to rhetorical attacks on Taiwan rather than physical attacks. All of those are breaking down. So, and at the same time that the military balance between the United States and China is shifting, and so I don't see, there was talk recently in the press about will there be a surprise between the election and the inauguration, this test where the PRC takes advantage of the lame duck to invade Taiwan. I'm pretty comfortable that that's not going to happen, just because amphibious invasions, I'm told, I'm not a military guy, are really difficult to do. And they take a lot of organization, and they take a lot of things that we would see happening before they're happening, and they don't appear to be. So, the short term, I'm not relaxed, but I don't think it's very likely. But you know, the what worked before is breaking down, and I'm not sure what replaces it.
Thank you.
Dave, I see a $1 million question here from George Taylor. If you were advising President Biden, what are the top 3 things he should do vis-a-vis China?
Top 3. Okay, I'm gonna 3 places to go, and none of them are China. So you know, I would go to probably Germany to start off. You know, I would start the Biden administration. You know, I think he's going to be tied down at home for a very, you know, you can't go on January 22nd, but by January 23rd, if he calls me, I'd say, hey, you got to get to Germany, and hey, you got to get to Japan. So those would be the first 2. You know, you shore up the alliances, and you say the United States as the leader of alliances, as the leader of the international community is back. So that's 1. The second is I'd get back in the Paris Agreement. And again, that gets back to 1, I mean, just you know, from the pure climate perspective is we need to be in there, but also a signal to the rest of the world that we are back as international leaders. And the third is we've already talked about, I'd sign TPP. And I'd get it to the Senate. And I'd tell the Republicans in the Senate, look, I want to work with you. And this is really difficult for me because it's not popular in the Democratic Party. So here I am reaching out. This is your opportunity to demonstrate that the United States, that our system can still work, that I'm taking a risk, you need to take a risk as well.
Thanks. We have a question comparing Mao and Xi. Mao put a higher priority on control than economic growth, and Xi seems to be following in his footsteps. Will the priority on control diminish future economic growth for China?
So yes, I think so. And look, there's always a price to economic. Well, actually, China doesn't buy that. You know, their take is, and it's hard to argue too much. They say that, look, tight control, actually, that there's too much chaos in the US system. There's a lot of creation, but there's a, you know, and creative destruction, but there's also a lot of destruction. And a heavy hand of the state prevents that. We can muster state resources and send them to where they need to be. We can marshal in response to the COVID or other national priorities. And I think that to some extent that's true. To some extent, though, you know, it is unsustainable. I talked about China being at 300% of GDP debt. You know, the money's got to come from somewhere eventually. And you know, my concern about the Mao or Xi sort of model of governance is that it certainly does. You know, a really centralized system enables the leader to make good decisions without all the mess that we have in the United States about, you know, sort of making economic decisions. But what happens over time is that it also enables that leader to make really bad decisions, and it blocks up the channels of information that would tell the leader, hey, this isn't working, there's a problem here. And you saw that it writ small with COVID, at the start of COVID, right? Where no one wanted to tell the leadership, hey, you know, I know it's Chinese New Year, but there's this terrible disease breaking out and we really should do something about it. So everyone said, okay, we'll wait till Chinese New Year's over. We'll, you know, it'll probably go away. It'll all be fine. I think that writ large is the risk that you see in a really centralized leadership structure like that.
Dave, I have a question for you. It seems like Democrats and Republicans in the United States overall are united in supporting a more hardline policy towards China. So I don't think Biden would have that proclivity, but to what extent would he have like domestic political leeway to reduce tariffs and just overall begin with a more cooperative relationship with China?
So, you know, if you read what Biden's advisors are saying, you know, the people who are in foreign affairs and that sort of thing, I think we will see we'll see a different tough line with China, but we will see a tough line with China that, you know, that particularly on areas like tech competition, that you're going to continue to see a lot of friction in the relationship. But I think you're also, I personally think there's leeway to say, look, you know, if China wants to produce X, Y, and Z, and you know, there is no such industry of that, and it's not particularly sensitive here in the United States, that you know, that kind of tariff doesn't serve a U.S. interest particularly well, and so you know, we can look at removing that. Ultimately, I think the difference will be that a Biden administration, I would think, will take is that, and you know, it's kind of ironic. I spent 5 years working Afghan policy in the Obama administration, and then the complaint was, oh my God, you know, we do these endless meetings about policies, and you know, every level of government, you talk about what are we going to do next, and then you review that and you do it again. And we are at exactly the opposite now in the Trump administration, where the agencies wake up and they find out, we got a new policy. You know, there's a tweet out that says now we're doing this, and so you kind of rush to paper over, you know, to sort of come up with a policy to line up with what the White House has said. And the problem with that is you get really disjointed, not very coordinated, and not very strategic approach to things. And I think the promise of an administration that takes a more traditional approach to an issue, but still recognizes that there are real concerns, that the U.S. has a real challenge with China, is that you get a lot less of the sort of arm flapping and gratuitous eye poking that has gone on in the last 3.5 years. And the energy is spent, not just U.S. energy, but also energy from Japan and the EU and India, on issues that we all agree that these are the real issues, the real problems. And, you know, we probably have to identify a handful, 2 or 3 things that are the priorities and push on those. And I think that's the promise of a more structured and, yes, more painful and lots more meetings approach.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That does it for our questions. I want to thank you for such a very interesting presentation, and I know all of our audience would like to join me if they could in giving you a round of applause, but you won't hear it, I'm afraid. Have a wonderful evening.